Just a quick little video on checking your parts. If you happen to be building an engine, you never want to trust that things are correct. I don't care who it is that you're getting the parts from, you always check them. And you see here, this is actually, if you look at my one video a while back talking about the 347 parts, this is actually when I built, or when I bought these 347 parts. I can't talk tonight. Spring and summer 2010, that's when I purchased them. Every single imaginable dimension I checked and documented back then. And there's good reason for that, especially with these Chinese crankshafts. What you'll find is they don't have the crankshaft, their crankshaft grinder set up correctly. And many times you'll have a taper from one end to the other of that crankshaft, where you'll end up with, on one end, a larger journal, and then as you go across, that journal gets smaller and smaller, or vice versa. Sometimes it's just on the rod, sometimes it's on the main, sometimes it's on both. So every single rod, piston, pin, crankshaft, whatever, I document every single dimension. Right down to the 10,000ths of an inch. And now this was 3 years ago that I did this, and now that I have the money to possibly put this engine back together, I can refer back to this and say, okay, where are my problems? Well, I know where a lot of my problems are. The pistons really aren't a problem. They varied a little bit, but really not enough to really matter. But a rod bearing clearance, on the other hand, was a problem. Some of them are too tight. Some of them are getting a little bit on the loose side, mainly too tight by the looks of it. I guess 2 4/10. That's probably about right, but I'm getting down to 1 8/10 on some of them. That's too tight. So what I'm going to end up having to do then is mixing and matching bearing shells to see if I can't change that dimension to get it closer to, I like to have 2.5 on the rods on the engines that I build. I know people go tighter now, but basically for what I do, 2.5 is just about right. And the first dimensions here I did with using a snap gauge, and then I didn't like the way those readings were varying back and forth, so I thought, well, snap gauge isn't necessarily the best way to do it, so I got out my dial bore gauge, which has a resolution of 1/10,000ths, and I was actually pretty doggone close between the two. There's a few of them that varied a little bit. You know, we're talking a 10,000ths here and there. And now I know that definitely number 1 and number 2, I got to somehow, and also a number 6, at the very least, I got to somehow swap bearing halves around. Also, what I did was I bought a set of 1X rod bearings, which basically they're one oversized, so it gives you 1/1000th more clearance. What I'll probably have to do is take one shell of the 1X and then one shell of the standard, and then that should put me pretty close to the range I need to be. If I'm 2 3/10, I'm not that concerned, but 1 9/10, 2 1/10, 1 8/10, that's getting too close. And then you come over here to number 4, I'm doggone near 3/1000ths on it. So that's, unfortunately, if you're a guy like me where you're trying to race but you really don't have much money, there's no way I'm going to be able to buy a $5,000 crankshaft. I'm buying the Chinese crankshaft, and then from there on out, making my tune just as conservative as possible, limiting my RPMs, and doing what I can. to hopefully make that crankshaft live, and then at the same time mixing and matching bearing halves. Yeah, it sucks having to spend another $100-some on rod bearings, but that's a lot better than having to spend $2,000 more on a crankshaft, or sending that crank out to somebody, spend another couple $100 to get it ground just to come back and find out it's really no better. Because yeah, that's the garbage I've got back from people in the past. So anyways, I guess the lesson I'm trying to push here is never trust anybody's work. I don't care how reliable they are or how reputable, or if you've seen them in car magazines or whatever. I know if you look over here, I got that ATI super damper. Well, about 10 years ago, I got into a pretty heated argument with the owner of well, actually it wasn't, it was the son of the owner of ATI at the time, who I think is actually running it now. Sent me some transmission parts. Sent me a C4 front pump that was broke right out of the box, and sent me a C4 forward clutch hub that was also cracked right out of the box. And argued with him back and forth. He tried to tell me that I did it and whatever crap. So it doesn't matter who, and obviously ATI is a pretty reputable company, and for the most part, they put out good parts. ATI super damper is pretty much a standard for the industry, and ATI superchargers are great, and most of their transmissions are too. But even with them, I had trouble. So I guess that's the lesson I'm trying to push forth in this video, is you never trust anybody's work. You check everybody's work, including your own. You don't trust your own work either, because hey, you might be having a bad day and you miss something. So, and actually what I'm going to do, it's been 3 years, I'm going to check all these dimensions again, make sure I didn't screw up somewhere. But anyways, I just thought I'd talk about this a bit. Just remembered another example of not trusting anybody's work. These are my ARFR number 1450-205 heads, circa about 2006 is when I purchased these heads, and they were just doing the changeover from 11/32 valves to 8mm valves. That's the diameter of the stem on the valve. And I received these heads, and I was looking them over and everything. Something just didn't seem right. The retainers were sitting on there kind of crooked, and it seemed like the locks were sunk way down in. I just didn't like the looks of it. I started pulling one apart, and things just did not seem right. And I took the spring off and kind of assembled the retainer with the lock onto the valve without any spring, and the doggone thing would almost pull right through. And I'm just like, something's not right here. This can't be right. Well, what they did was they put the 11/32 lock on, and of course the 11/32 lock is thin, and if I'd have not paid any attention or not disassembled this engine, which basically I would have anyways, because I took every available dimension on these heads just like I do everything else, every valve stem, every valve diameter, length, stalled height, pressure on the springs. I matched up the pressures on the springs, stiffer on exhaust and a little bit weaker on the intake, which you ask, why would you do that? Well, because the exhaust heats up more, so it collapses a little bit quicker. So I usually put the stiffer ones on there. And if I hadn't done that, the first thing that would have happened when this motor fired is that I probably dropped all 16 valves if I'd even got that far with it. And luckily I discovered it, like I always, most of the stuff I usually do. Emailed AFR and said, hey, what's up? This is what I think's happening. They were very quick to send me the correct locks, and no doubt about it, these heads had the wrong locks on it, more than likely. Like I said, this was around the time they were changing over to the 8mm stem, and somebody hadn't been trained yet, so they assembled these heads with the 11/32 locks, and man, that could have been an absolute disaster for this engine. So that's another example I just thought of. And then back to ATI, hate to hammer on them again, but I just remembered the valve body that I have in my C4. I purchased that off, actually purchased it off of eBay, and it was an ATI, just reverse pattern, fully manual valve body, not a trans brake valve body. But the guy was selling it really cheap. He said it just never worked right, didn't know why. So I took a chance on it, paid like $100 for this $500 valve body, got it home, disassembled it, and there was a great big scrape on the one casting that was leaking off fluid pressure, and that's probably why the valve body never worked right. And I ended up cleaning things really well and using some DevCon aluminum epoxy, filling that in, sanding it down flush, and that valve body has worked perfectly for me ever since. But that was just another example from ATI. And actually, now that I keep thinking about it, so far I've never gotten anything from ATI that worked right. I've got that super damper there. I hope that's the first one. I'd sure hate to have that be an issue. But again, never trust never trust anything you buy. I've bought oil pumps before, always disassemble them. I found them full of chips and garbage and dirt and whatever else. Same thing with carburetors. I've pulled them apart and found machining chips filled in them. The fuel cell in my race car, I put it in there, started dumping fuel in. It was the fuel was running out about as quick as what I was dumping it in. Well, obviously I stop and use my electric fuel pump to pump as much as what I can out. Here they didn't tighten the bulkhead fittings up. I had to yank all that wonderful foam out of the inside of there and tighten the bulkhead fittings. They were literally finger tight. So, I've run into this many times. You check and test everything. Never, I keep harping on this, and it's probably getting irritating, but I guess I'm trying to really make a point here. Anything that you build or anything that you buy, never assume that it's correct, because I work in a production environment as well, and I see mistakes there, and if it's the end of the month, sometimes those mistakes just get sent out regardless, because they're looking to get that end of the month dollar figure met, and they'll deal with the problems later. And that's the reality of life. That's the reality of production, and that's just fine. But don't be the victim of it. Check everything out, test everything, and I've harped on this long enough. I think you get the idea. Just make sure you do it.